I'm Scott Allen Miller. It's the 20th of October, 2023. This is my vlog of daily life living in León, Nicaragua. Today we're going to be answering some questions that viewers had about veterinary services and what is available and how you get it and like what kind of equipment and so forth is available here in Nicaragua and just things that you need to know about bringing animals here. We're not going to talk about the process of bringing animals. That's its own topic, but we will talk about what you can do once they are here for sure. We're also going to run through some myths from my childhood. This is a BuzzFeed thing, but why not? Of myths from school. I found it very entertaining. We're also going to be on this particular day, because this is Friday the 20th, heading out in the evening to the Sakasa concert at Via Via and going to be recording that. Hopefully that turns out great. We're going to be trying out some new stuff with that concert. Fingers crossed that everything goes well, and I'll be bringing that to you in the next few weeks. We'll get to that right after the bump. Today's episode on the day of. I'm recording it the next morning. It's Saturday, it's late morning, and it has been raining or drizzling the entire morning since maybe 9:30, and it's coming up on noon, and it is absolutely gorgeous here. We don't often, even during the rainy season, get rain in the morning. It'll happen, but it's definitely the exception, and so having a nice slow rain, also the exception. Our rains tend to be sunny in the morning and then in the early evening when it starts to get a little bit dark, and then normally clearing up by night, but having it rain into the night is not unusual. Getting rain in the morning or a light drizzle is unusual, so this is a gorgeous morning and I'm standing out in it. I did a little bit of recording of a specialty episode today as well. If you took the time to watch my one, that's a little bit of a rant, but it's my pointer information video on why we can't help people in Africa violate their visa requirements for traveling to Nicaragua. That was recorded just a little bit ago when the rain was heavier. Before we get into any of today's serious topics, I want to read this article because it's on my phone and queued up that came up in my Apple News today, and I think it's well worth just remembering. If you're my age and from the United States, I bet you're going to find these things ring true like crazy. This is a list of things we were taught in school. Almost all of us were taught almost all these things in school, and they're completely false. These are like old wives' tales. And some of them were science that was just not backed up, like someone just made it up and they added it to school curriculums, which is still happening today like crazy. And some of it is just completely fake news. Some of it was actually terrible at, well, we're going to cover some of this, right? But this is ridiculous things that ring true as like a common narrative of false information that we were all taught in school. All right, starting at the top of the list, that strangers will give me free drugs on street corners and in Halloween candy, along with razor blades and other things. Like, you would not believe how much advertising we got as kids. This is mostly for Gen Xers, right? I don't know how many millennials got the same stuff, but as Gen X, these items are so ubiquitous that everybody was going to give us drugs. It was always going to be free. There's going to be so many drugs of every possible type. They spent so much of our education convincing us that drugs were great, so much time teaching us every different drug and when to take it, which one you would like under which circumstances. It was the biggest advertising campaign for drugs you could possibly imagine. The budget that the U.S. government put into pushing drugs on Gen X is bigger than anything that the Sinaloa or the New Jalisco or anyone has ever considered, right? It is insane. An entire generation taught that you were a huge loser if you didn't do drugs. They had they had a whole department just dedicated to getting police to push drugs. The DARE group, to make it look really, really to create basically police-backed peer pressure to make you feel bad if you didn't do drugs. Like, it was crazy how much pressure they put on us and how much formal education went into this is how you do drugs. They would teach the mechanisms, they teach you where to find it, but they also strangely taught, I mean, that's strange enough that they actually spent money teaching everyone how to get addicted to drugs, but they also taught you that you were definitely going to find people who were pushing drugs on every corner. The only people who have ever pushed drugs my entire life was the government. I've never met any person who went around offering me drugs or trying to get, like, that just doesn't happen, right? But the government spent years, TV, movie theaters, billboards, forced classroom education, how to be a junkie. It was one of the biggest foci of the U.S. education system in the 1980s. Number 2, I learned about how tongue taste maps work. Turns out, completely falsified. Absolutely true. We were taught that so much. It was in every textbook on biology, completely made up, not based on anything whatsoever. We were taught that all fat was bad for you, thus everyone pushed fat-free foods. Of course, that created all kinds of health issues because fat is good for you when it's appropriate. Like anything, good of fat is good for you. And instead, they used it to sell sugar. Number 4, in pharmacy school around the turn of the century, we were taught that people in legitimate pain don't get addicted to opiates and opioids. I don't know exactly how much that was taught in regular school in the 80s, but it seems like it was. It felt like it was only a thing, like only if you, by the nature of being addicted, meant you didn't get it from a doctor, right? And obviously the majority of addiction is from doctors. Doctors are the ones pushing opioids, always have been. Number 5, that George Washington's teeth were made of wood. Yeah, everyone's taught that. I don't know why. This is a huge one. This one bothers me so much, which is funny. You'd think the drug ones would. Once you get to high school, no one will accept papers that are not written in cursive. It was a huge thing, right? And of course, cursive was just a made-up way for people with bad handwriting to cover it up and make it seem like an excuse that being lazy and trying to be fast and not taking handwriting seriously could pass for acceptable. Of course, no one in any technical profession was ever allowed to write in cursive. No one doing a serious paper, anything that had to be taken seriously, could write in cursive. Cursive was always the resort of the lazy and the uneducated. And we knew this in school. We knew it when I was a little kid, right? We knew that you typed things that you wanted to be legible. And if you needed to handwrite something and it needed to be legible, you had to print because you needed people to be able to read it. Cursive was when it wasn't important enough for someone to have to read. If you're making yourself a note for the grocery store, I need a dozen eggs. Yeah, you can be as sloppy as you want. It's for you. When you're writing for other people, obviously, you'd have to be an idiot to think that cursive was meant for other people to read and that they lied to us about it. Like, everybody lied about it, but it was the filler that they used at school. By the time I got all through elementary school, even though they pushed it hard, it was still that they preferred if we typed things. Anytime I typed something, they were like, oh, that's better, because the teacher could actually read it. And by the time I was in high school, we got huge benefits to not writing in cursive. And by the time I got to university, it was absolutely 100% out of the question. If you wrote in cursive, it was a 0. It was thrown away. They were not going to accept that. No serious person would ever accept that, and ever did. They didn't accept it in the 1920s. They didn't accept it in the 60s. They didn't accept it in the 80s. That was completely false. Teachers push that just because it's the easiest thing. Oh, you need to write everything twice. It kills a lot of time. You don't have to be trained as a teacher to fill time that way. The food pyramid. This one, I think, had some like effort or research behind it, and it just wasn't true, but I'm not sure how much they knew they were falsifying that versus just having bad ideas and repeating things that everyone had said for so long. But we were taught that a lot. These are things we had to be tested on, right? And now we know weren't based on anything. This one also big, that your permanent record will follow you into adulthood. My permanent record wasn't used to get me into university, and all of my university work went without any of my work from high school. And most of my university work didn't consider any of my other university work. Like, the idea that these records move with you is crazy. And I mean, they call it your permanent record. It is the least permanent thing ever. It's one of the reasons that I'm so adamant about homeschool, because the effort that goes into a record that isn't actually your record is huge. It wastes so much time. And of course, if you think about things in an international context, of course that record can't follow you anywhere. And of course, no serious job even cares if you went to high school. They care if you can do the job, right? They want to make profits. They're not there to support your school system regardless of the value of the education you received. It doesn't make any sense. Number 9, you can kind of excuse people, because we did believe this to some small degree, that you won't always have a calculator with you. Of course, even by the late 70s, we had a pretty good idea that you were always going to have a calculator with you. But okay, not everyone believed that, but most people, and as kids, we really had a pretty good inkling. Like, we were already getting calculators for cheap at every store. We always did have them with us as kids. Why wouldn't we have them with us as adults? They were on our wristwatches and all kinds of things. And, you know, we started having computers in the late 70s, and much more like in the mid 1980s, but So we had calculators everywhere. They were literally, and the idea that you would go to an office and that people would want you to do math, whether it's for accounting or computer science or regular science or whatever, the idea that you would do any of those things and not use a calculator was really weird. Even when we were little kids, it's like, well, you would have to use a calculator. No one's gonna wait for you to do it by hand, and no one's going to trust you to do it by hand. That makes no sense, right? Calculators were the only thing that made sense since the 70s, and before that they had slide rules, and you were required to know how to use them. So why did they think, or why did they claim that people wouldn't have calculators? It wasn't very reasonable as a thing to say to people who were already in a world where everyone had calculators. Like, now we're like, oh, everyone's got a calculator on their phone, and that is true, but by the time they were telling us we wouldn't always have calculators, we already all had calculators all the time. That's why they had to tell it to us. They were trying to convince us not to use the calculators we all had. All right, I once asked one of my elementary, so this one's not something that the rest of us had happen, but it's worth reading. I once had one of my elementary school teachers, I asked one of them what a rainbow was, and she told me scientists hadn't figured it out. Yeah, we'd known that for a really long time. I walked around until my early 20s thinking that. Also, I think it was the same teacher who told me that Columbus thought the earth was flat. That I was taught. They were training teachers in a different way in the 70s and 80s. It's honestly one of the reasons I'm thankful for the internet, because depending on your teacher or an outdated encyclopedia for answers could be a real roll of the dice. I also had teachers, for example, that taught me that how to tell time wrong, because we never figured this out. We don't know if the teachers didn't know how to tell time, very real possibility, or if it was adults, like the parents of some of the kids who didn't know how to tell time and told the teachers that they were going to get them fired if they didn't tell the wrong time so that the parents didn't look like idiots. We don't know, but yeah. Number 11, you only use 10% of your brain each day. I like the each day. Like, your car only runs at 10% each day. What? That's a little bit weird, but the 10% thing is weird. I don't know why they came up with that, or how they came up with that, or what it even means, because all of your brain is engaged all the time. But just a wives' tale that they taught. They put a really hard number on just some myth and taught it as fact. How so many things got taught as fact? This isn't on the list, but we were all taught, and many of us had to memorize. I don't know if I did, but a lot of people had to memorize a list of dinosaurs and all these dinosaur facts. And a lot of the stuff was taught as it was not to be questioned. It was absolute fact. If you said, oh, is this stuff that we're just guessing? They would get really angry. This is science. We know these things, right? And now it hasn't been that long, and at least twice, everything we know about dinosaurs has completely changed. Nothing I learned is valuable, except that bones are found in the ground and you clean them with brushes and need to be careful. That's the extent. They knew that thousands of years ago, right? There's been no science. And now, I mean, quite honestly, like, I get the science behind, we think dinosaurs turned into birds and all these things. Like, there's a lot of research that goes into that stuff. But you have to remember, we've been told this multiple times in our lifetime and treated exactly the same. Do we really, like, I haven't put in that much research onto it, right? But, like, I have a hard time accepting dinosaurs definitely came from birds definitely came from dinosaurs, because it was only 30 years ago that it was unquestionable and unthinkable to suggest that they didn't come from, that lizards didn't come from dinosaurs, right? We were taught this in the exact way that they're teaching this other thing now. Is there any reason to think the thing that they're teaching now, other than having more time to have the theories evolve better, is any more likely to be true? It's more likely to be true because it seems like a better option, because they've put in that extra little bit of time. But it's only 30 years, and they're just correcting an obvious mistake. The pattern of we just made up a theory and we're telling you it has to be true and you're not allowed to question it is way too much of the education system, and all the way through, right? The way it's presented on television, the way that the government treats it, the way that, they say, this is what science says. Science doesn't say that. Some guy who's paid to have science in his title says that, and some other people agreed with it, but lots of those people with the exact same credentials said something different not that long ago. So that system is not very reliable. And there's reasons why it wouldn't be. We do evolve our decisions and theories over time, but the idea that once you present it as this is fact and not this is what we think right now, you're not a scientist anymore. My primary school teacher told me our bodies can't make new blood. I definitely never heard this one. This is unique, I think. And that we're born with all the blood we ever have. As someone who gets nosebleeds, I knew that was bollocks. When I questioned that adults were obviously bigger so it would have more blood, she said it was watered down. Yeah. The biggest problem there is just that teachers were allowed to get away with bullying people instead of answering or admitting that they didn't know things. The whole a meteorite killed the dinosaurs thing wasn't yet the accepted theory when I was a kid. That one, I guess that I think that was the accepted theory, but we still don't completely know. And honestly, we don't know what the dinosaurs were. So, yeah. No one is going to wait for you to look up information in the real world. You have to know it. I can kind of see why people taught that. They definitely taught this, right? You had to memorize all these really useless facts that you really would have to look up pretty much anytime you were going to use them. But I understand the idea that a lot of people didn't understand that lookups in our futures would be fast. But pretty early on, we had a pretty good idea that they would be. It's been a long time. Number 15, this one's huge. The United States government prevents abuse of power through a well-engineered systems of checks and balances. They taught this hard, and especially now, but we've known this, right? It took, you're told this, and then you're taught how the government works. And the moment you're taught how the government works, it's clear there aren't the checks and balances. Now, for example, there's no check whatsoever on the Supreme Court. They are given unlimited control. Nothing oversees them. Nothing at all. And they have said this. They came out this past year and said the Supreme Court has the power. The Supreme Court said this, right? They have the power to determine if any check on them is something they will accept. And they said if they're given a check on their power, they will turn it down, right? So it is a absolute dictatorship by the Supreme Court, which is very interesting that there is a definite dictatorship, has always been a dictatorship, and it is for life. And it is the Supreme Court. It's actually a Supreme Dictator committee, and that's kind of interesting. But there's no getting around, given what the Supreme Court has said this year, that the Supreme Court is an absolute dictatorship by committee, and that there's zero checks whatsoever. So the well-engineered system of checks and balances was completely a fabrication, as there is no check or balance at all, none. It's 100%, but they always looked to other branches. Well, the president does this, Congress does that. That's great, but neither of them have any power if the Supreme Court says that they don't. The Supreme Court has final say, period. And total say. Anything can be brought to the Supreme Court, and what they say goes, regardless of any law that Congress makes, regardless of what the president says. None of it matters. The Supreme Court is the only final voice. But they really pushed this hard, even though it was obvious from the things they taught it wasn't true. Like these things about the Supreme Court, those were also taught that there was no check and balances, so it didn't make any sense. But the effort to promote that there was a functional democracy, or even an attempt at democracy, was big, and remains so, I assume. 16, that we would all but run out of oil by the year 2000. That one is pretty amazing. They were certain when I was a kid that we were not going to have oil by the time I was an adult, and now as an adult, they're like, we have so much oil that we should never look at alternative sources because it's endless, right? What? All right, 17. I was taught this, not very much, like it was just mentioned, that lemmings commit suicide. Not a thing, but they did teach that. 18, I'm from the US, so they didn't teach this one way or the other, that Canada didn't ever have slaves, which they believe they still don't teach. The United States doesn't teach that Canada had slaves, but they don't teach that they didn't either. They do teach that a lot of places had slaves, so maybe that's lumped in with it. This one's big because we all went through this at my age because of the Cold War. Hiding under your desk at school at 10 a.m. on the last Friday of the month while the teacher placed a name tag on your wrist, I don't know about the name tag on your wrist thing, would protect you from an atomic blast. We literally were taught that the buildings we were in would not protect us from an atomic bomb, but that the little piece of plywood sitting on our desk would. That the entire city would be wiped out, the buildings would be wiped out, but we didn't have to worry about radiation, we didn't have to worry about any of those things because our desk would protect us. Now, we're being taught, now rightfully, right, they're taught that an atomic blast isn't even a real risk. First of all, why were they training people about that? If an atomic bomb hits, you're done, right? There's nothing you're gonna do in a school unless you have really serious bunkers. And now, just normal events in a school, you can't be protected by a desk. And lastly, if you study well and have excellent grades, you'll end up with a nice job and lots of money. Obviously, that's exactly how you don't get there. People who are working really hard on having really good grades tend to focus on placating the teachers and not on actually learning material, and tend to be focused on the mechanisms around the education process rather than the creation of value and training. And so actually there's a pretty strong correlation against spending time getting good grades and being able to get good jobs. Similarly, if you look at the Department of Labor in the United States, every additional degree you get, from associates to bachelor's to master's to doctor, each one reduces your lifetime earnings on average, right? The more education you have, the less you earn, because good grades education, formal education, which is not real education, right? They're kind of opposing concepts. If you really want to learn, the last thing you do is go to university. You just go get resources and learn if that's your actual goal. And the more time you spend not teaching yourself, but sitting in a classroom or talking to educators, the less you're going to earn, and probably the less you're going to learn. All right, that's my 20 thing. I just found that list really interesting because it hit so close to home. Like, these are all things we grew up with in my age and everyone I knew. And those kinds of blatant lies and teachers who, whether it's teachers or the government or whatever, that took such an effort to not be truthful and to not be logical and to not be educated, is something that really drove home with me. And I've spent a lifetime really being impacted by how it really affected me, how much I distrust that system because of those actions. And now, you know, living in Nicaragua, this actually applies. I get the same behavior from the U.S. government, the blatant and obvious lies about Nicaragua, things that nobody should believe, right? You read the U.S. State Department stuff and say, oh, look at all these warnings that clearly don't apply to the modern world. They're from some other era, yet they're still there. It doesn't take any real effort to say, oh, that's not right. Something's totally wrong. Why would I listen to the State Department? I don't know what they're lying about, but I know they're lying, right? But do people? Not very often. And they're willing to just keep doing it. And the school systems keep doing this stuff, which is why we homeschool. So some of these play into our overall life decisions as well. And everywhere does it. I'm not trying to pick on the U.S. I grew up in the U.S., so it was my government that I'm aware of the specific trends that happened to people my age in my country. All right, next up, we're going to talk about veterinary services and functionality in education here in Nicaragua. All right, this one comes from Patricia Flaherty, and it's a little bit old as well. I guess it's only like a week old. It's not that bad. I'd also like to see a deep dive into veterinary care in Nicaragua. Now, I'm going to preface, I do want to have one of my vets on the show, and we just haven't had a chance to do that yet, but I do want to do that and tour some clinics. I'm watching this while waiting for some blood test to be, some tests to be done on my dog by an internal medicine veterinarian. I saw the 24-hour emergency vet in your neighborhood walk the other day, but what services do they offer? Do regular vet clinics in the area have access to complete blood work in-house? Most places around me here in the States seem to send it out and you get results a few days later. I find that surprising because I work with hundreds of vets in the US and almost all do it in-house. You should not have a problem. It is so easy to do it in-house, like you could do it in-house if you wanted. Are there specialty hospitals? Or is there a veterinary university in Nicaragua? Do they have the ability to do ultrasounds, CAT scans, and MRIs if necessary? Is there a dog blood bank in case of a transfusion if necessary? My dogs have needed services like that in the past few years. Is there an emergency vet that can do surgery if a dog bloats and has gastric torsion at 2 a.m.? And would there be a taxi available to take me and my dog to the hospital in the middle of the night? My dogs are my family, so I'm more concerned about medical facilities for them than I am for myself. I hear you. My dogs are my family. I flew them on a private jet down to move here. I have this house with this big yard and everything for my dogs. Like, trust me, I hear you. I also saw some post on Facebook, so take that with a grain of salt, saying sometimes you'll find people practicing as veterinarians who aren't actually veterinarians. Any truth to that? All right, that's a lot to cover. So I'm going to have to reference my phone quite a few times as we do this. So let's start with the last one first because it's in my mind. I believe likely this is probably true. This is a country that is much less regulated, and there is a lot of ability to hide someone performing tasks without being certified, especially if you're not dealing with like humans, right? If someone was practicing as a human doctor, wasn't actually a human doctor, I would guarantee that they would get caught pretty quickly. I imagine that if you were to falsify being a veterinarian and be able to do a decent job of being a veterinarian and not have people constantly reporting you for doing something wrong, that you might be able to slip through the cracks and perform for quite some time. You'd still have to pay your taxes or you get caught very quickly, but if you simply weren't certified as a vet, I imagine that there's some opportunity to get away with that. Going to university here is not expensive. In many cases, it is free. This is a free education country. Not for all education, but for much of it. Some of the best schools in the country are free. So the idea that someone would go become a vet, do all the effort to learn how to be a vet, but not go and use the free or very cheap education to get the degree so they don't go to jail over it is weird. So while I think it's possible, and I'm sure someone can find someone somewhere who's obviously trying to scam the system, I think you'll find it to be very few and far between, and I'd be really shocked, I mean truly shocked, if you, putting in any effort to find a good vet, ever ran across a situation where you were going to be fooled by that. You would have ruled out just the nature of things, right? If you're going to be a real vet, you're going to be trained, you're going to show off your credentials, you're going to have a good clinic, you're going to invest in it. Those are things that someone who's scamming the system can't do, because one inspection and they're in jail and their business has been taken away because the whole thing was a fraud. Right, so it would be really obvious. Anyone who was doing this would be operating out of a shack, would not have the equipment, would not have it. Like, it would just be obvious, and you'd be like, I'm not taking my dog to this crazy guy, right? Even if he was a real vet. So I think you're going to be protected from that. But could it happen? I think it's much easier to run a scam like that here than in the U.S., but I don't see the benefit of it. In the U.S., the amount of money you could make from doing that, and the ease of slipping through the cracks of the political system, not the legal system in the U.S., you could theoretically make millions of dollars doing that in the U.S. and evade the prosecution, because it's so easy to do that in the U.S., right? It's the U.S., when you commit crimes, it's easy to slip through the cracks, and when you're innocent, it's easy to get bogged down by legal quagmires. And so it's the kind of thing where here, if you were committing that kind of crime, you would expect to be prosecuted and lose. And in the US, you'd probably lose, but your chances of dragging it out and keeping a bunch of the money and having made a ton of money in doing so might make it a worthwhile payoff. So while I think it would be, if it's an experiment in how much you can get away with, I think you can get away with more here. But if it's an experiment in how much it makes sense to try to get away with, I think it flips the tables on that pretty significantly. So we would see. We'd have to really test that theory, but I don't think it's a real risk that you'd have to worry about. All the vets I know here are definitely very heavily trained. All right, let's go back to the top and start there. You saw, what kind of service do they offer at a 24-hour vet? Well, the one we saw on that particular walk is a very small neighborhood in a very small part of town without access by road. So I'm imagining that the services they offer are relatively small. It is probably one doctor and whatever equipment he has offering that. Are there larger clinics that offer more things? Absolutely. Are there ones that are 24 hours? Yes. You're going to find most of those in Managua, but do they exist other places? Yes. What is typical is that you have people who are on call, not clinics that are open, like accepting pets nonstop 24 hours a day, right? They may be open, but not like fully staffed. You'd have to wake people up or whatever. But generally there are services for pretty much whatever you need. Do regular vet clinics in the area have access to complete blood work in-house? Yes. Just like in the US, that equipment is very cheap. It's between $5,000 and $10,000. You go to someone like IDEX and you can do all that work in-house. Sending out does happen in the US, but it doesn't have that much value. And with how much vet clinics cost to operate today, that is my parrot going crazy in the background. With how much vet clinics cost to operate in the United States, running a clinic in the US without internal blood work is a bit weird because it really is so cheap. Even here, I've worked with people to open a clinic, and the cost of doing inside blood work was I don't want to say trivial, but it was so low that it wasn't really something you would question. It's like, are you going to do blood work in-house? Yeah, obviously, right? It doesn't make any sense to send it out. So yeah, I definitely, clinics I work with here do their own blood work. I'm sure some do not, but I'm unaware of any central blood work locations because everyone does it in-house. Are there specialty hospitals? Probably in Managua. I've never had to work with one. And this is, we're going to bring vets on and really dig into stuff. Is there a veterinary university in Nicaragua? Yes, not just in Nicaragua, but multiple, and at least one of them is here in Leon. The veterinary education industry in Costa Rica is very, very low at this point, and the one in Honduras has collapsed. And so Nicaragua, which is generally an education country, it always has been, education is a big export of Nicaragua, and so the veterinarians for the region, many of the ones, but not all, for Costa Rica, and basically all for Honduras, are all trained here in Nicaragua. So we're the education center for veterinary. If you're going to be doing vets, if you have pets and you need veterinary work somewhere in the region, this is the place to be. I'm sure Guatemala's fine, like up there, they're richer, bigger, but down here in this region, we're kind of the epicenter of veterinary services. Do they have the ability to do ultrasounds, CAT scans, and MRIs if necessary? I'm not sure which of those they have access to. I'm sure there's ways to get all of that done, but it's definitely not every hospital has that by any stretch. I bet most of that you'd really have a hard time doing anywhere but Managua. Is there a dog blood bank in case of a transfusion? I have no idea, honestly. I'm going to say no, but it's possible. Your dogs have needed stuff like that in the past few years. Makes sense. It's unfortunate that it may not exist, but it may not. Is there an emergency vet that can do surgery if a dog bloats and has a gastric torsion at 2 a.m.? Yeah, pretty much any qualified vet is going to work around the clock. That is how it works, right? Same with doctors. This is not the US where people just check out and let things go. This is a place where people take these services seriously. These are real professionals, right? Who are passionate about saving animals, and it's also their job, so they want to get paid too. And you don't turn down paying work, especially when that paying work saves a life. So it's in every which way, right? But it's important to understand. And I know compared to human medicine, you know, American vets have a tendency towards being much more passionate about actually saving lives and doing a good job. You rarely, and certainly you do have this happen, but when you talk to human doctors, it's the exception to have someone who's like, oh, I really care about, I don't care about the pay. I do all this because, you know, I don't sleep at night and I'm fighting the regulations so that I can work longer hours and I can save more people and I can do the right thing. There are people like that, but they're not the norm. Most people are like, my parents told me this would pay me a lot of money. That's why I'm doing it. Where's my money? And it's a career that punishes people who want to do a good job, so people tend not to. Veterinary falls in the middle. It pays an outrageous amount of money and requires an outrageous amount of dealing with politics and crap like that. But you get tons of doctors who are frustrated, like, I just want to save a cat, I just want to save a dog. I would like, you know, these are our furry friends, and I got to do. You're going to find a lot of that, in that. But even so, in the U.S., the idea that someone is going to open up their clinic in the middle of the night or come to your house to take care of something that's an emergency is pretty much unheard of. Now, here in Nicaragua, it is normal, whether you're human medicine or veterinary medicine, to make house calls, because that's kind of a requirement for proper health care. In many situations, it is not safe or practical to move a patient who is ill or injured to a place of medical care. It is far better to bring the doctor to the patient. This has always been the case, and worldwide is just an accepted part of healthcare, unlike the US, where it is, and vets do this, but human medical almost never does. They will do anything to transport a person to another location, no matter how dangerous or life-threatening that is. It's very strange. Here, even if it's muscle spasms, you can have someone come treat you at home. When I lived in Ukraine, the same thing. We had kids who were sick, and the doctors came to us. They said, well, obviously we would come to you. We can't have you go to a hospital. That would be irresponsible. That's how you have sick people interact with other sick people and make more sick people. Seems obvious when doctors say it, but in the US, the idea that you would do things to reduce exposure and make for higher quality of healthcare at the expense of the convenience for the doctors or for the healthcare facilities for billing management is unthinkable. And so rethink how that is. Here, our vet comes to the house all the time, whether it's to see the bird or to see the dogs or just to check up on things. And, you know, sometimes we take the dogs there as well. It all depends. Whatever's convenient, whatever makes sense for the best care for the animals. And the idea that they wouldn't do it, they'd be flabbergasted. What do you mean not go to where the animals are, not do what's needed to provide healthcare? Of course they're going to do that, right? So yes, not only could you, and there's also the question, would you be able to get a taxi? So first of all, there's always a taxi, right? Maybe not at like 5 a.m., but there's basically always a taxi available. There's also the vet themselves will likely come and transport the animals or come to you. There are lots of options that could happen. There's one way or another, they're going to make sure that you're able to get care. Are there going to be veterinary clinics that won't open up? Of course. Make sure you have a good one. That's the case anywhere. You have the same problem in the US. Just make sure you have good care, good vets, and you're going to have round the clock very good care for your animals that will either provide transportation or make it unnecessary to have that transportation. If you're wondering why I'm suddenly itching, I'm like, wow, I feel like I'm being bit. It was ants in my shirt, like biting me around the collar. Like I have no idea what's going on. I don't know where they came from. I can't find any on the ground. Maybe I stepped in them at some point and I don't know. But yeah, I'm being bitten by ants that I don't know the source of. I think that pretty much covers the questions that I'm able to answer within this. So I think overall, I think you'll find the veterinary care here is pretty good, but you do want to do some planning ahead. Make sure you take the time, find a very good clinic. You're going to need to put more effort into that than you would in the United States. Being in rural areas will create more of a problem. It'll be more challenging than you're used to, but being in the cities, you should be in pretty good shape. And I'll try to get my vet onto the show so you have some firsthand information that should prove to be quite useful. Pretty sure I still have ants on me. That's driving me nuts. In other news, this evening we went out to see Mario Sacasa and his band playing at Via Via. It was a really great show, had a good time, and we recorded that. I have that recording. I haven't checked the audio yet, but the video is looking pretty good. But I moved it off. We're using the Olympus. We do Still struggle with that Olympus camera. It is not going to be fixed until I'm able to get to the US and get a new Fuji camera. Hoping to do that relatively soon, but by the end of the year is really the best we can hope for. And no, the new Sony ZV-1 that I have waiting for me in Houston is not going to fill the bill. It is only meant for short clips, really high quality short clips, so it's meant to do about 5 minutes. The one I have now is meant to do 29 minutes, often doesn't. I need one that can do external power, is meant to record continuously. Just very different category of cameras to do the shows that we do. It's very demanding, and because rooms aren't air conditioned here, we need a lot of active cooling to have any hope of doing what we do. The camera I have, even at 1080p, shuts down from overheating while doing a normal show, and I need something that's able to do 4K or higher continuously. So I'm very demanding as far as both the environment and the style of recording that I do. To that end, something that I'm giving a try, we just picked up Topaz AI. It is a Dallas, Texas created artificial intelligence video and or photo, I only have the video portion, enhancement software that I'm able to do a lot of work with videos and upscale them. So I'm taking what I have of the shows, and this is the first one that I'm testing it with, trying to upscale it to 4K from cropped 1080p, and from the sample footage I've seen, it looks fantastic. It's doing a lot to clean it up. It's not the same as if I was recording in native 4K or higher like I am with this camera, but it's really enhancing the image a lot. And for something like a concert, absolutely makes sense. It makes everything smoother. It just looks so much better, and allows us to do some zoom in and so forth in ways that we really couldn't otherwise. It would just be really blocky. But it's going to take days, and I mean it, literally days of compute power to render just the pre-edited files for me to then edit for the video. So it's going to be a little bit extreme by the time it's all done, but hopefully the results are going to be worth it. So I'm giving that a test tomorrow. I'm going to be seeing what it does, but we recorded that tonight in a really good show. So that show, because it's one of the long format shows, is going to be headed over to our partner channel with the Nicaragua people. I'm helping film for that channel because I like doing this stuff, and they need these kinds of films done here in Leon. So I've been doing that, and so if you want to go check out the work that I'm doing there, whether it's the ones I just did or the ones we have upcoming, it'll be at least a week, if not a couple weeks, for this Sakasa video to come up. This whole week is going to be very busy with videos. Today, Friday, is the Sakasa show. Then tomorrow, Saturday, the 21st, is a multi-band concert event going on at El Bodegon here in Leon. And then on Thursday, Caroline Lopez and Ronnie Duarte are playing at El Padrino downtown. So we have 3 different concerts that we're already on the schedule to record in the next 6 days. So that's going to be keeping us very busy, and editing all of that is going to be a lot of work. So doing my best to keep up with that and testing out this Topaz AI to see how that goes. Hopefully it won't be very useful for this show. Once in a while it may make sense, because if I'm doing stuff from the 360 cameras, those often come out in either 1080p or 2.7K, and the Topaz does let me move that up to 4K, but I don't know if you guys ever notice. Could be worth playing around with, because often those are very short clips. For the concerts, they are massive clips, right? So it's hours of footage, not minutes of footage, and doing AI for those giant files can be very difficult. I'm also running out of storage for everything. Even just the current shows that I'm working on at any given day is often more than I have hard drive space to work with on the file. So that is a really big challenge that we're constantly trying to deal with. Thanks for joining me. Like and subscribe. Ask your questions, scroll down and ask away on things that you're interested in, topics you want me to cover, questions you have about Nicaragua, whatever. If you'd like to support the channel, you can buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/Scott Allen Miller. I always put contact information and stuff on the show, so if you need to reach me, it's always there on the show. It's always in the show notes. Please don't ask, how do I contact you? In the show notes, look at the show notes. It says right that you're literally commenting on the episode or the thing that says, just watch one of them, because I can't post it in YouTube. So if you're actually watching, it's there. And if you go onto the YouTube page, it says, show me the like whatever. There's like 4 or 5 different ways to contact me in every episode. So I'm not going to respond if you ask, because it means you haven't watched the show, and I'm like, what was this? It has to be a bot, right? It has to be some kind of phishing attack asking me how to contact, because the show is just flooded with contact stuff. Nika Laurel contacts, Nika Graham contacts, Instagram contacts, email contacts are everywhere, right? Can't miss it. And you can, of course, post on YouTube, but don't ask for that because obviously I already gave it on YouTube. Share on social media, tell your friends and family about the show, and I will see all of you tomorrow.